What is poppin' YouTube? Back again with another video. Today we are doing my wide receiver tier ranking, so you know who to start if you made the semifinals. Congratulations if you are here. The first tier we're going to be talking about today is the S tier, and we got AJ Brown, CeeDee Lamb, Tyreek Hill, Amon-Ra St. Brown, Justin Jefferson, and Stephon Diggs. When we're starting it off with this tier with AJ Brown, yes, it was hard for me not to put Tyreek Hill, who's been there the last few weeks, but since he didn't play this last week, and honestly this week Tyreek Hill's going up against the Dallas secondary, it's just a little bit less of a matchup for the Dolphins than they've had the last few weeks, but still like some Tyreek Hill. This week, we got AJ Brown leading this tier off versus the Giants. Absolutely great matchup for AJ Brown. I know the last 2 weeks for AJ Brown haven't been absolutely amazing. So if for some reason you didn't win last week because of AJ Brown, I understand. But going up against the Giants, it's an A+ matchup. We do like some AJ Brown here. Then we move on to CeeDee Lamb versus Miami. And on the other side, flip side of things for Dallas versus this Miami secondary is a little bit easier than the Dolphins going up against the Cowboys secondary. I do like CeeDee Lamb here as my wide receiver 2. Like we said, my wide receiver 3 is going to be Tyreek Hill still. You can't really push him down any further. We'll have to see how he performs this week after he didn't play last week, but be ready for Tyreek Hill to have an absolute huge day because he is going after that 2,000-yard receiving record. Then we move to our next guy here, and it's going to be Justin Jefferson. And I know I had Justin Jefferson probably way too low last week, but him coming off that injury just had me a little bit concerned, but we saw everything that we needed to see. Losing to the Bengals is definitely hard, but they are still kind of trying to make this late round wild card push in the playoffs. 14.3 fantasy points. We'll have to see if Nick Mullins remains the starter this week, but I do like some Justin Jefferson here. Then we move on to our next guy in the tier, and it's going to be Stephon Diggs versus the Chargers. The thing with Stephon Diggs versus the Chargers, we saw what that Chargers offense could look like. So it could get ugly. The Bills, as much as they had a really rough schedule heading down the stretch, this matchup turns out to be a little bit easier without the head coach, without Justin Herbert. So what are those point differentials going to be like between the Buffalo Bills and Chargers? Could be a lot based on what we saw last week with the Raiders. So I like Stephon Diggs here. I'm a little bit worried about what that second half is going to look like, whether he's going to be playing a ton or not, but that doesn't necessarily matter, and that rounds out my S tier. Then we move on to our A tier. We got Mike Evans, Cooper Kupp, Deebo Samuel, DJ Moore, DK Metcalf, and Brandon Ayuk. Starting it off with Mike Evans. Mike Evans was getting overshadowed by Chris Godwin this last week, and there was a lot of parts of me that was like, crap, what's necessarily happening? And then all of a sudden, he hit pay dirt. He got 4 of his 6 passes, 457 yards and a touchdown, really helping making that fantasy football impact for you with 16 fantasy points. And this week goes up against the Jacksonville Jaguars. Absolutely love this matchup for both Mike Evans and Chris Godwin. But since Mike Evans has been the clear wide receiver 1 this whole season, I will be sticking with Mike Evans. Moving on to Cooper Kupp. And maybe there's a part of me that I should have put Cooper Kupp a little bit higher. But going up against New Orleans, it was good to see Cooper Kupp put up 25 fantasy points this last week. Because if we're looking at what he's done the last 3 weeks, 25 fantasy points, 26 fantasy points, 15 fantasy points, my guy's starting to get hot. And I think he's just starting to get a little bit healthy each and every week from both of those ankles. And I like some Cooper Kupp versus New Orleans. So start him really great here in the A tier. Moving on to our next guy, and it's going to be Deebo Samuel. Deebo Samuel's been doing nothing but putting up fantasy football points. We look at his last few weeks, 22, 34, 36, 22. Absolutely insane numbers for Deebo. And we were early in the season. I mean, he was having similar type days, but Brandon Ayuk was really overshadowing him. No longer the case. Deebo Samuel is back to being the clear wide receiver 1. The only issue is this week he is going up against the Baltimore Ravens defense, and we've seen the Baltimore Ravens defense. We've really started to see the Baltimore Ravens. They really lock down these wide receivers, so I'm a little bit worried about Deebo overall and this whole 49ers team, but we've seen the type of offensive outputs that they've been putting up all season, so you're starting Deebo as a wide receiver 1. Moving on to our next guy in this tier, and it's going to be DJ Moore. DJ Moore has become a completely new player since Justin Fields has come back from injury. And that's not me saying anything here. I mean, last week versus Cleveland, last week in PPR, put up only 9 fantasy points, but the weeks before that, 27, 22, 23. So I like some DJ Moore with Justin Fields. Now, going up against this Cleveland defense, it was hard. Their corners were there. They didn't have safeties, but their corners were still very healthy. So for me, this week going up against Arizona is an absolutely great matchup. We've seen what Justin Fields has been able to do. I'm projecting DJ Moore somewhere around that like 13 to 14 fantasy point per day finish. Absolutely love to have him here in our A tier. Then we move on to the next guy, and it's DK Metcalf. We saw in the Monday night game with Drew Lock, just throw it up to DK Metcalf, and he will get it with 13 fantasy points. And like we said, he's put up 13, 13, 37 the last 3 weeks. So we like the upside that he overall possesses. But I don't know if it's going to be Geno or Drew Lock next week. But going up against Tennessee on Sunday, it's a good matchup for DK Metcalf. And these Seattle Seahawks wide receivers are all going to make the list today, which is crazy because they haven't all done that in a few weeks for me. Like some DK Metcalf here in week 16. Moving on to our final guy in the A tier, and it's going to be Brandon Ayuk. Brandon Ayuk, yes, has he been relegated back to his wide receiver 2 role on this team? Yes, he has. But he's still put up very solid wide receiver numbers. I mean, only had 7 fantasy points this last week. Weeks before that, 17, 16, 13, 27, 15, 16, 11, 12, 10, 21. Like, he's going to get you at least 10 fantasy points, but is that same type of upside where he got the 33 that first week, 27 in week 11? Do we think that type of upside is still there? Not necessarily, especially going up against this Baltimore defense, but I do like Brandon Ayuk. You got to put him here based on the offense in the A tier. Moving on to our B tier, we got Puka Nacua, Chris Olave, Jalen Waddle, Rashee Rice, Devontae Adams, Devontae Smith. When we start this tier off with Puka Nacua, my man, 10 fantasy points, 14 fantasy points. It feels like the upside with Cooper Kupp isn't always there, but he's getting the targets, he's getting the snap share. Had 8 targets this last week compared to the previous weeks where he had 9, 7, 8, 7. So it's been kind of a far cry from his early season 15, 20, 10 target type games that he's been seeing here as of late. But let's be clear, when you're competing for targets with Cooper Kupp, you're going to be kind of splitting hairs down the middle. But the fact that he is still able to produce on a back-end wide receiver 1 level for you, even if you did pick him off of waivers, is still highly incredible. 13.2 fantasy points. It's kind of where I'm projecting him this week versus New Orleans. Like him here. Move on to our next player, and it's going to be Chris Olave, who's going to be in that same matchup. Is Chris Olave going to play this week? I know he screwed a bunch of you this last week by not playing. I know he was a non-participant on Monday. Like we said, we're recording this and putting this out on Tuesday, so there's a chance that Chris Olave doesn't play this week. I'm just putting him here because I assume he is going to play with that ankle. 13.1 fantasy points. It's a pretty decent A- type matchup versus the Rams, so we do like Chris Olave here. Moving on to our next guy, Jalen Waddle. When the news broke that Tyreek Hill wasn't going to be playing last week, I was like, ooh, yes, let's go, Jalen Waddle week. And Jalen Waddle delivered. 28 fantasy points, wide receiver 2. If you had Jalen Waddle somehow and you were just expecting a up type performance, shout out to you for probably starting him because that boom upside was great. But this week going up against Dallas, like we said, we don't love the matchup. And we also don't love the fact that Tyreek Hill's coming back for Jalen Waddle's overall upside, but still have to put him here. Move on to Rashee Rice, and shout out to Rashee Rice. I think this is the highest I've rated him all season. Going up against the Las Vegas Raiders this week, and Rashee Rice has done nothing but prove me wrong these last 4 weeks. 25 fantasy points, 14, 18, and 24 this last week. He's getting somewhere around 10 to 9 targets a game. Clearly has stepped into Patrick Mahomes' number 1 wide receiver. It's so great to see a wide receiver being able to get open, catch the ball, and run after the catch for Patrick Mahomes. But still, Rashee Rice versus Las Vegas. I can't really put him any higher because of the lack of consistency all season, but the last 4-week little sample size has been absolutely amazing. Move on to our next guy in this tier, and it's going to be Devontae Adams. Devontae Adams is going up against the Kansas City Chiefs, and like we said, they just absolutely put the beat down on the Chargers this last week, where Devontae Adams finished as the wide receiver 8 with 24 fantasy points. Can Devontae Adams get in that 20-point fantasy football range this week? I don't know, but that's kind of the hope, and that's why I think he does have the ultimate upside, and that's why I put him here in the B tier. And then rounding out our B tier, we got Devontae Smith. Devontae Smith for the Eagles versus the Giants, 12.4 fantasy points is kind of where I'm projecting some Devontae Smith. Moving on to our C tier, we got Garrett Wilson, Calvin Ridley, Nico Collins, T. Higgins, Cortland Sutton, and Jaden Reed. Garrett Wilson is versus the Washington Commanders. Can Zach Wilson throw him the ball? That is to be determined. Calvin Ridley, he's put up, okay numbers, but like nothing crazy. Bottom end wide receiver 3 numbers the last 2 weeks. Going up against Tampa Bay, he's getting the target share. He just necessarily hasn't found paper dirt, and maybe if he scores that touchdown that got reversed this last week, we're talking about him in a little bit different light. But still, like some Calvin Ridley, would be throwing him in your lineup. Nico Collins as the clear wide receiver 1 with CJ Stroud being back. Maybe Nico Collins is a little bit low, but versus the Cleveland, we don't love this matchup for either CJ Stroud and or Nico Collins, so do have him here. Then we move on to T. Higgins, and T. Higgins had himself a day. I think he made himself quite a bit of free agent money based on last week's performance. It's hard for me to put him any higher, but if Jamar Chase, which is being reported that is going to be out, and that's why he's not in these rankings, there's a chance that T. Higgins should be a little bit higher in my rankings. 22 fantasy points this last week, but I do like T. Higgins here in my C tier. Rounding out our C tier with Cortland Sutton, who's been on a little bit of a here with 12 fantasy points, wide receiver 29 last week, and then Jaden Reed, who's another waiver wire darling, 17 fantasy points this last week, put him as wide receiver 17. So we like how Jaden Reed is constantly getting himself involved. So I do like some Jaden Reed here. Then moving on to our D tier, we got Zay Flowers, DeAndre Hopkins, Terry McLaurin, Tyler Lockett, Amari Cooper, and Chris Godwin. Zay Flowers being the clear wide receiver 1 in this offense. DeAndre Hopkins with Will Levis. Can they get things going, as they've had a few disagreements, but versus Seattle, we definitely like this matchup for him. Terry McLaurin had himself quite the day this last week, and with 26 fantasy points, put him up as the wide receiver 3 on the week versus the Rams. Going up against Jets, we don't necessarily love this matchup for him. Tyler Lockett, like we said, it's kind of been him and JSN battling for that wide receiver 2 spot, but he had himself quite the day on Monday Night Football. Amari Cooper, we do like the matchup, and maybe Amari Cooper is a little bit too low in my rankings, but but it's hard for me with Joe Flacco and the inconsistencies that does bring to an overall offense. Chris Godwin, I was way too low on Chris Godwin last week. I got that one 100% wrong. That's 100% on me, but we still have him here in our D tier. Moving on to our E tier, we got Jordan Addison, clear now wide receiver 2 with Justin Jefferson being back, and Jacoby Myers, Drake London, Deontay Johnson, who seems to always get a touchdown. Maybe I'm too low on Deontay Johnson this week. Brandon Cooks versus Miami, and then Adam Thielen rounding out here in our E tier. And then rounding out all of our tiers here for this week, we will be having Odell Beckham, JSN, Curtis Samuel, Romeo Doubs, Noah Brown, and Josh Downs. And I'll say this about this tier. JSN, shout out to that amazing game-winning catch. We absolutely love to see it. It's hard for me to really put a ton of separation between him and Tyler Lockett, but I did in these rankings. But I do think at any week, JSN continues to have a pretty good resurgence towards the end of the season. Curtis Samuel, we do like the volume that he's getting with the Commanders. Dobbs as a second wide receiver in this Packers offense behind Jaden Reed. We like what he's doing. Noah Brown kind of slides back to being that wide receiver 2 with Nico Collins being back, and Josh Downs, who I've been pretty runabout in start sits as of recently. With Michael Pittman Jr. being out, and I should probably double check that, I still think Josh Downs is going to have himself a pretty big day. So appreciate you guys for tuning in. Here's the full tier list. We will be back again with another wide running back video this week. We're also going to be putting out some Dynasty content for those of us that love some Dynasty. So I appreciate you guys tuning in, and I'll catch you on the next one. Peace.